So that's where it was all messed up. Had some grind marks. We filled that. The lower quarter's not bad. It's not amazing, but I think it'll show good with the color we're putting on it. I think I said in the last video I wouldn't do another video, but well. So this is where it was low back there. You can see dark and light primer. So what I did is I filled back there and I brought it in so far till it matched. Now up here we had a little M, which it turned out I ended up running the filler through there all the way back. What I mean by M is like a double hump instead of a, you know, just a nice smooth surface. So now it's been checked with a block, and admittedly I used 180 and 220 for most of this work. And what I did is I went crisscross, and if I had some high spots I might have went back and forth with the DA, and then I went up and down, kind of rounds it out. But I'd only go a little bit. Then I'd grab a board file, one of these right here with a 120 on it, and I'd go over that, and that would cut it down fast and straight. Then I switched to a 220 on the DA and orbited it around, and you got to make sure that you pass about the same, right? Because you don't want to take it down and make it weird. And again, this isn't going to be a crazy show car, but it's pretty smooth. We're happy with it, you know. And you check it with the 120 on the board, and you can see the sand scratches. And if you don't, you got to go until you do, and you know, back and forth, 45 this way, 45 that way. But it looks pretty good. I think there's a place back here where I was going to fix it up a little bit, but I don't think I have to. I now realize that they got buried in the primer, so that's good. Again, that hole in the fender, that's supposed to be there. A bolt comes through the back and holds the big chrome piece that goes there. Not sure if that shape down there should be that way, but it's how it was made before I got it, so I just kind of smoothed it out a little bit. And for what this car is, I think that'll be totally fine. I also found out that here someone hit it too hard with the board file, so we overfilled it a few coats at a time. But the same thing, I basically started here and I went up and down, and I went up and down this way, right, you know, kind of on a 45. And what I do at the top is I give it a little spin. Now I go a little quick at the top and a little quick at the bottom, and in the middle I go a little bit slower, and I just keep going until, because you want to run it as even as you can across, back and forth. And you'll notice high and lows even with the DA. But I did take the block and I stayed on top. I didn't go into the old bodywork, because what you don't want to do is be cutting into the edge down there and down there. You just want to cut off what you did. So you try to stay in and you try to stay in, and then eventually it kind of starts blending into the door anyways. So you don't force it, you just kind of stay on the filler that you added. Hopefully it's tall enough, and keep going back and forth. A little bit with the DA, that just takes it down a little faster. But make sure you use a board back and forth. Like a Durablock would be fine as well, right? But to get down there, I found, you know, I'm sitting on the crawler on the floor. I found it just easier to use the board file with the handles on it. If I had this sitting up 3-4 feet in the air with, on stands or on the hoist or whatever, I'd probably do it with the Durablock. But either thing works fine. So it is straight. And what I did to make sure it was straight, I didn't do all the work and try to prime the car. You can see light and then dark primer, and there's a reason for that. That's a little bit of overspray, and the reason why, well, some of that is just basically dust from when I sanded it before I came back here. But what it is I came so far to where I thought it would blend out pretty good, and then I hit it with a little bit of primer, and while it's wet I got way down here and I looked in that direction, and basically you come like this and you come right across, and while it's wet with the primer you can see how straight it is. And then I could definitely see where this came further than I thought before, like it was above this patch, so there was 2 lows I fixed, but I drug that right across and brought it out. I mean, that's pretty good. Now if this was a big high-end show car, I'd put a bunch of filler down in there and I'd smooth that out a little more. But I'd also probably put some high build primer on this and block the whole thing with, you know, lesser grits. But for what we're doing, this is good. That, as far as I'm concerned at this point, is going to be scuff and paint. Scuff and paint. And I think I, down here, showed you where there was some spots that I didn't like the bodywork. It was kind of cheesy, and it wasn't cracked, but it looked like it was almost cracked. So I ground that out, refilled it, blended it in. Now you can see at the bottom of the fender it kind of curls out towards the rocker. That's because whoever did the rockers for this guy, and he was pretty upset about it, he got them done at one time and the guy had made them too far out. So what you're going to have, you can see how the fender comes out a little bit past the door. But that being said, we're not going to worry about it. The customer is okay with it. And like I told him, I said what you could have done is put less filler there and then added a piece of metal across the bottom. The thing is, you're adding a shape that wouldn't have been there originally. Basically, you can mimic the rocker and put a piece in there. But, you know, and the other thing you could do is put a buttload of Bondo across the door and board it all in. But you're going to get a fat door, and if you open it and chip it, a little chip with this you can touch up with paint. Once you put that crazy amount of Bondo on the doors, I think what happens is then you've got a deep thing to repair if you chip anything. And I mean, I don't think he'd fix this if it had a couple chips in it anyway. But yeah, you can kind of see where the rocker gets a little bit fatter at the back. It's like he couldn't quite push it in enough. And some people, once they get it on, they have a close enough attitude and they go with it. Now, on the Satellite, we had a lot of issues like that we cut and pushed in and realigned stuff and fixed stuff. Some stuff we couldn't, but most of it we could. And we did it enough that everything is board filed nice. But I find if you're just going to Bondo the hell out of a vehicle and board it, and I mean, I'm not saying that that's good or bad, I'm just saying if you're going to do that, you're better to have a bunch of filler on the quarter, because this is what you want for the door edge here. See, these doors are good. The door edges are nice and clean, front and back. So that little bit of a, and look at that. It's literally right at that very bottom corner. Like, see what I mean? There's not much of a stick out. I wouldn't put that much filler on the corner. If anything, I'd cut, push the quarter in, and if the quarter's too small, fill the quarter, but don't fill the door. I mean, you can to some degree a little bit, but you don't want that edge of the door to be super thick and you open the door and it kind of doesn't look right because it's thick and thin. But anyway, that's what we got. Bottom of the fender. The bottom of the fender only has one coat of primer. We'll throw another one on. Well, you can't really tell. You could probably shoot right over it. And then the top up here had some repairs and whatnot. We shot a bit more primer on there. So that can be basically, so basically this side of the car is scuff it, clean it, ready for paint after it's all taped up. And I almost felt like a hooray moment there with a great victory. And I came over here and realized I had all these to do. However, a little bit there we got to take down. The tape is just to protect the chrome, even though it's pitted. We don't want to make it worse. And then down there, and then everything else is just chips and a skim coat. You can see here where, no, not that one. This one here I did, but I did it by hand, and it's totally fine. I did that by hand, and it's totally fine. And I mean, these two, like it'd take like 10-15 seconds a piece. You just keep moving down. This one's a little bit thicker, but see now I got to fix this and fix that down there. This one here, probably hit it with the machine with 220. Now keep in mind, you've got to prime it and then send it to 320. Now, with a base clear, you'd probably do this to a 400, and it depends. Read the TDS sheet on your products. It'll tell you what to bring it to. The single stage I use, you can run 320 on a DA, and it'll bury it no problem. And honestly, if you had a little bit of swirl somewhere under this this pale turquoise paint, you're not going to see it anyways. And on this car, again, this car doesn't have to be pristine by no means. It only has to be as good as the rest, right? Which, you know, this is some of the chromes, right? And I mean, this won't be any less of a car. This is a running, driving, nice little car. Or big car. I don't know. Nothing's big after working on that old Cadillac up there. We're going to have to dig that out of the hole soon. The steering column is out for repair. Well, the owner is a mechanic, and there's something in the steering column, and I didn't ask him what it was. I just took it out for him and sent it to him. But when we get that back in the next week, this can come out of the hoist area because the hole underneath is restored. So That'll come out of there and end up back there. That car's going to end up right here. We've got a Corvette frame off that's going to end up on the hoist. Now, I'm probably jumping the gun because I actually got a Firebird that's going to come in here for a little bit. And we're just going to give it a scuff, touch up a bunch of stuff, and reshoot it. And it's going to be a nice paint job, but it's a refresh. It's not a complete resto either. So, and again, like, everybody wants this and that, and some of the viewers, like, you know, they say, why don't you restore it, and why don't you go further, and or they nitpick about certain things. It is what it is, but I figured I'd make another video just because I'll have this done before dinner. It's already 4 o'clock today. But this side I thought was going to be hell. I thought I'd be at this for today and tomorrow, and it's like anything else. You get better and better at it. I used to do this a different way, and I was always afraid of the DA when it came to trying to file something straight. However, there's some guys that do it and they're good at it. Now there's a few guys that do it and they have a little bit of waves and they just don't care. And again, depends on the car you're doing. I don't think this one's going to be overly wavy. And if there is wave in it, like, it's going to be blended in that you won't really notice it. And keep in mind, a really old guy spent 30 years playing around with this, fixing it up. And, you know, it wasn't... Like, when I took some of the stuff out to fix what I saw, there was like welded metal showing, and that's as far as you can go. You got to stop, right? So I filled out most of it that was bad, but a little bit down around the bottom and stuff, you know, it's hidden enough that with the blue. And keep in mind, the only spot that's I'm seeing down there is a little bit weird to look at. It's because there's a patch this way, and then there's a patch that way. You could put a bunch of fill there, but there's a big chrome that goes on here, and it kind of shoots forward and goes, like, you're only going to see about half of that, and I think that's going to basically, nobody's going to know, right? So now if you're doing a restoration, you're going to know, and you're going to take all that junk. But keep in mind, this had like random patchwork and chunks of metal welded in. I didn't realize the doors were really good, but they are. But the lower front fenders have been welded in, all down there, front and back. The back tires has been welded in. The new rockers were put in, and then he had to patch out to the rockers. So it is what it is. It's kind of an old school 80s style body job, which is what the guy did. And because I'm not particularly old, but I worked with one of those old guys back in the early 90s. I worked with a couple body guys from the 80s. So I know what that old school body work, how it was done. And keep in mind, this was a time where no one had an English wheel, no one had a shrinker stretcher. And there was some people out there that were masters, and don't get me wrong, but most shops, you'd cut a chunk of metal, put it in place, bunch of filler, kind of shape it to the car, good enough, paint it. You know, people were paying a few $100 to get their car shot, right? So no one was spending a lot of time on it. But even a really big job, you know, there was no aftermarket wheel arches, so you just welded up what you could and you made it. So, I mean, to me, this car is totally fine. It's what they would call an older restoration if they went to sell it, even though we're going to throw the bottom paint on it now. You know, so it is what it is. And proof of concept of that. Old school okay, so this car, we found out some of this patchwork was before the owner owned it, 1974. 55 Pontiac. Now this is the 55 Canadian Pontiac, which is basically, they took the 55 Chevy body at one of the GM plants in Ontario or wherever, somewhere in Canada, and they basically changed the rear quarter. They made a Pontiac style front end, like a Chieftain or a Big Chief or whatever. There's a few different ones, and they basically, you know, Pontiac ran a small block, not a 350, but they ran a small block. Whatever the 55 Chevy was, we had the Canadian 55 Pontiac, which is, it's a short 55. But anyway, the owner had this car since 1974. Bodywork was done before he got it, and he did it a few times. This is what was hiding underneath. You can see where that was all welded in. So we've got that all cleaned up and scuffed up. We're going to start putting a filler on that soon, but there's a few places where there's little hollows, like right here. So I'm going to take my little shot blaster and, you know, blast those out, clean them up, just so that it doesn't fail again. Now keep in mind, people say, oh, that kind of work, you know, It always fails. 1974, it only started failing about 3-4 years ago. So this body work has been, it's older than me. So we're taking it out, we're fixing it. Another example right there. Another example right there. A little bit up in there, must have had a crack or something. Whole section was welded in there and down and around, and it goes in behind the hood. Now, no, we're not stripping this car right down to nothing. Anything that's hard as a rock, it barely comes off, and I don't know what that old filler was, but man, it's good. Must have been the earlier plastics in the 50s, 60s. I don't know when they switched over, but you know, everybody knows about how they used to use lead, and then eventually they had a filler. So this must have been an early job that was done when the filler was good. Like you can see the dark, that's not rust, that's actually the, I think it's resin that's dried between the filler and the metal. Because anywhere where you took it off, there was this weird brown stuff, and I showed that in another video. But you literally just run the DA across it and it's gone. Here's the top of this one. So you can see a little bit of green. And my dad, who was a millwright, when he sees the green like that, he believed that what happened is they left the flux on. Not a big deal, because the car was probably only going to last 5-10 years anyway. They flooded it with filler, called it good. But 40-50 years later, the filler, and this is the thing, it was failing about this way. So you had about 1 inch and change on each side of wherever they welded it together that was failing. Everywhere else, as soon as you came here, it was hard as a rock. You couldn't chisel it off, like it was on there. So that was kind of cool to know. So if that'll last that long, there's nothing wrong with that. But anyway, the reason I'm showing this car after showing that car, when we talk about 80s bodywork, no panels, the car had been hit at one time, and he knew that there was a 55 Chevy fender welded to this car, but only a section of it, because the wheel arch is different. And you can clearly see where they cut it out, torched it together, but at the bottom, they ran it straight across to the front, and someone had to hand make this bottom piece to get that little body line that Pontiac has. Now that patch is kind of crappy because it is welded. Like you can see these, it's like little electric welds, like a spot weld, but you know, they were pointy. But up here, they clearly didn't do that spot. So we're gonna make this shut. But before we do, we're going to blast a bunch of rust converter in there just to make sure. Now that it wasn't failing there. This car was failing a wee bit down here and right up in this area. Now here, the filler was a little thick. I'm going to actually work some of that metal out so that there's less filler. But if that and that is fixed properly, it should last even longer than last time. But you can see how they made this front section. And here they had to weld another section, and then up here, whatever happened, they had to make a bigger piece. So, and it's all pin welded or spot welded, if you will. The old French guy that taught me years ago used to call them pin welds, and I remember that was common at one time. You'd grind stuff off of an old repair, and you'd see those little dots, which I think was just a pointier spot welder. But yeah, look at all this metal, lasted no problem. You can see there's a dent here where we couldn't get that brown out, but that's not rust. Again, look at that. See what I'm saying? Anyway, we'll get in there and go around the weld just to sandblast, make sure we get all the little bit of junk that's sitting in the pits out. And one thing I'm pondering, because of the brass in it and whatnot, the bronzing from welding, some guys will argue that you put your Bondo on the metal after the metal's rough. That's what I like to do. The fillers, the Bondos, whatever you want to call them, they're made to go direct to metal. At least the ones I use. They're pretty tough. Now, because of the brass, I'm wondering if I should take my epoxy primer. Now, some guys will strip everything bare and epoxy prime, which is fine. But I'm kind of wondering if we should just even run narrow the fan down on the gun and run about, so big right over this to something to stick it right with the epoxy primer. Then make all the rest of the metal. There's still more stuff that I'm going to take off of here, but anyway, so I'm wondering if I should run epoxy primer on all those torch welded joints. Like down there, obviously that don't matter. We're going to sandblast the grooves out. It'll be rough as hell. The filler will stick. I don't know how well it sticks to this brass. It could be that it just goes over top and then, you know, years later it fails. Man, for torch welding, it's sunk in just enough that you can put filler in. It's pretty smooth. But then when they did here, they kind of warped it in. Probably with the heat and whatnot, eh? But anyway, so old school bodywork, no patch panels. You did what you could, you made, and this is pretty good because they actually made that. But I've seen where people just made a quarter panel, ran it straight, cut it out, made shapes basically by putting Bondo, filler, whatever you want to call it, all over the car, and then kind of shaped it out of filler and fiberglass. And where here, at least you've got kind of old school primitive metal work, but it allowed for the filler to be less than 1/4 of an inch, which is your goal. At the end of the day, that's kind of what they tell you. 1/4 inch, you're kind of maxed out. Now I've seen some old 80s jobs where the filler was, you know, a good inch. And I mean, did it crack and fail? Well, after 20, 30 years it did. So that's just something to think about. You know, the old school patchwork wasn't real great. Still got to strip that door. There's some weird dots on it and bubbles, whatever you want to call them. When you sand it, you get these little rounds, so you know that it could be swollen, which means it's failing underneath. So you got to take all that out. There's a patch down there. You're probably going to go from here. Now on the other side, it was easy to see where it was failing because it was kind of crackling everywhere. But on this side, I'm not going to chance that, so we're going to have to probably strip this whole fender. And we know these have been repaired. And even on the other side, I didn't bother stripping it off yet. But once I get to where I'm happy, I know those are made out of filler and whatnot. We're going to cut those right off, make new ones. If you look at the front, 1/4 tips in. And back here, it's stuck way out, like it's the wrong shape. And the other one's better, but not great. So I'm going to cut those off. We're just going to make them fit the car. And I mean, I'm not going to try to make them original because we're welding a lot of the trim holes shut in this car. We're just going to make them so that they look like the ones ahead so that everything flows nice on the car. Because what we're doing, we're going to run a bit of nickel around there. We're going to run those 2 strips, both on the fins on the back and on the hood. And then all these little holes, we're going to weld all that shut. Going to make it nice and smooth. And instead of a grill, there's this big metal thing that goes in there and there's little slits on it. We're going to take all that nickel off, and it's got holes just like that. We're going to weld them all shut as well. Whole car is going to be somewhere between a satin and a semi-gloss black. Anyway, that video ended up being longer than I wanted it to be. Kind of made it 2 videos in one, a 56 Dodge and a 55 Pontiac. Anyway, that's it for me today. Cheers.